Subscribe now for more untold stories from Hollywood's golden age that were buried for decades. That night on the 17th floor of the Sands Hotel would change Frank Sinatra's life forever. It was a cold December night in 1963, and nobody knew this story would remain hidden for 60 years. Frank had just performed at the Copa Room with the Rat Pack that evening. Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, and Joey Bishop, they were all there. The room was packed to capacity. Vegas's most powerful men occupied the front rows. Frank was perfect as always, his voice like velvet, but there was something different in his eyes that night. I'd known him for years, and he only got that look when something big was about to happen. When the show ended, it was past midnight. The sweat on Frank's face glistened under the lights. The applause wouldn't stop. As he left the stage, he turned to Dean and said just one word. Dean's face went white as a sheet. Everyone who heard that word knew what it meant, but nobody dared speak it aloud. The Sands Hotel lobby was crowded as usual. The gambling tables were full, the sound of slot machines ringing in our ears. When Frank got in the elevator, only 3 people were with him: his bodyguard Tony Roma, his lawyer Mickey Rudin, and a man in a black suit whom nobody recognized. I'd never seen that man before, but the way he clutched that black leather briefcase showed it contained something valuable. When the elevator reached the 17th floor, the corridor was completely empty. There were only 3 suites on this floor, and all of them had been reserved for Frank that night. But the strange thing was, the door to the suite at the end of the corridor was open. A soft music drifted from inside. One of Frank's favorite songs, "I've Got You Under My Skin." Frank's shoulders looked tense as he walked toward that door. I'd never seen him like this in all the years I'd known him. The strong, confident Frank Sinatra looked uneasy. He paused at the doorway, took a deep breath. The smell of cigar smoke wafted into the corridor. Havana cigars, the kind only very special people could get in those days. When he entered, the scene that greeted him, but the real surprise hadn't even begun yet. 3 men were sitting in the room. At the head of the table was Sam Giancana, the boss of the Chicago outfit. Next to him, Johnny Roselli, the invisible hand of Vegas. The third man, even mentioning who that man was meant death in those days. All I can say is, he came from Washington and carried the president's seal in his pocket. Frank's hands trembled slightly as he sat down. Giancana took a deep drag from his cigar, slowly exhaled the smoke. The silence in the room was so thick you could hear the tick-tock of Frank's wristwatch. Finally, Giancana spoke. His voice was calm, but there was threat in every word. What was discussed that night concerned a plan that would change America's destiny. What they wanted from Frank seemed simple, but the truth behind it was a nightmare that would follow him for the rest of his life. The man with the black briefcase placed it on the table, unlocked it. Inside were photographs. When Frank looked at the photos, his face turned ashen. What he saw in those photographs, suddenly the phone rang. Everyone in the room flinched. At that hour, on that private line, only one person could be calling. Giancana picked up the phone, just listened, didn't say a word. When he hung up, he turned to Frank. There was a merciless glint in his eyes. He told Frank his position in Vegas was in danger. His shares in Cal Neva Lodge, his casino licenses, even his life depended on a single phone call. The empire Frank had built with the Rat Pack could vanish in an instant. But what Giancana wanted from Frank was worth more than all of that. When the man from Washington began to speak, his voice was cold and distant. He talked about Frank's connections to the White House, his friendship with JFK, the private parties, the nights the president stayed at Frank's house. But the real bombshell came next. What Frank had to do using this friendship was something no one could have predicted. Frank stood up. His face had turned bright red. He slammed his fist on the table in anger. Until that moment, nobody had dared to say such a thing to Frank Sinatra. But Giancana just smiled calmly. He pulled out a small recording device from his pocket. He pressed the button. The voice on the recording was Frank's, but he couldn't remember where or with whom he'd had that conversation. The words were clear, undeniable. If this recording came out, not just his career, but his life would be in danger. Frank sank back into the chair. He'd been trapped. At that moment, the door opened again. When Frank saw who entered, his eyes filled with tears. This person was someone he trusted most, knew closest, but that person joined them too. The betrayal was so deep that Frank couldn't speak. He just stared, unable to believe. Giancana gave Frank 48 hours. Either he would do what was asked, or he would lose everything. Frank's knees were shaking as he stood up. As he walked toward the door, Giancana's voice came from behind. There was one more warning. He mentioned Frank's family, his daughters. The way he pronounced Nancy and Tina's names made Frank's blood run cold. When Frank left the room, Tony Roma was waiting in the corridor. The expression on Tony's face showed he understood everything. As they walked toward the elevator, Frank stopped, leaned against the wall. He covered his face with his hands. For the first time in his life, he looked helpless. But what Frank Sinatra was about to learn was even more terrifying. When he returned to his hotel room that night, he found an envelope on the bed. Inside was a single photograph. The photo showed Marilyn Monroe, but Marilyn had died a year ago. This photo was taken just hours before her death, and the person visible in the background. Frank's hand trembled as he held the photo. Everything he knew about Marilyn's death was a lie. There was another note in the envelope. Just one sentence. "They can find you the same way, Frankie." Frank couldn't sleep that night. He stared at the lights of Vegas from his window. The city had never felt so lonely. Toward dawn, the phone rang again. It was Dean Martin calling. His voice was frantic. He talked about what had happened to Sammy Davis Jr. Sammy had been attacked after his show that night. The attackers had left a message. "You're next, Frank." After Frank hung up, he headed to the bar. He drank Jack Daniels, straight from the bottle. He looked at himself in the mirror. The man he saw was no longer the voice. The man he saw was frightened, cornered. But Frank Sinatra wasn't someone who would give up. By morning, he had made his decision. He called Giancana. The meeting place would be the secret room behind the Sahara Hotel. When Frank went there, he had no one with him. He was alone. He thought he would find Giancana alone when he entered the room. But there were 12 men in the room. They were all America's most dangerous names. They had come from New York, Chicago, Miami. On the table were maps, photographs, documents. Frank understood at that moment that this wasn't just about him. This was part of a plan that would shake all of America. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Frank did what was asked of him. He signed the documents. But what he signed wasn't just a piece of paper. That signature would ignite the fuse for what would happen in Dallas a year later. Frank didn't know it then, but when he found out, it would be too late. The secret of that night was known only by the 13 people in that room for 60 years. They died one by one. Some from natural causes, some not. When Frank died in 1998, he thought he was taking the secret to his grave. But Tony Roma was alive. When Tony died in 2021, he left behind a box. Inside the box were audio recordings. Everything that happened on the 17th floor of the Sands Hotel that night was recorded. When I listened to the recordings, my blood ran cold. Frank's voice was clearly audible. What he accepted, the deal he made. But the most terrifying part was the names heard at the end of the recordings. Among those names were people still alive, powerful people. The reason I'm telling this story, Frank was never the same after that night. On stage, he was still old Blue Eyes, but that light in his eyes had gone out. In every concert after 1963, in every song, there was the shadow of that night. Now I understand what he really meant when he sang My Way. He had wanted to go his own way, but had been forced to walk in others' paths. Vegas, in those days, was a city of secrets, but no secret was as dark as this one. The Rat Pack continued performing. The crowds kept coming, but something had fundamentally changed. Frank would sometimes stop mid-song, his eyes distant, as if remembering that December night. Dean noticed it, Sammy noticed it, but nobody dared ask. In the months that followed, strange things began happening. People who had been in that room started having accidents. One drove off a cliff in California. Another had a heart attack at 42, perfectly healthy until that day. Frank knew these weren't coincidences. He started traveling with more bodyguards, stopped taking certain routes, wouldn't eat at restaurants he hadn't checked first. The Washington man called Frank regularly. Each call brought new demands. Frank had to arrange meetings, introduce certain people to certain circles. He became a bridge between two worlds that should never have connected. Every introduction he made, every hand he shook, pulled him deeper into a web he couldn't escape. Then came November 1963. Frank was in Los Angeles when he heard the news from Dallas. He locked himself in his room for 3 days. Tony Roma stood guard outside, turning everyone away. When Frank finally emerged, he looked like he'd aged 10 years. He knew what his signature had set in motion. The guilt would eat at him for the rest of his life. After Dallas, the calls stopped. The Washington man disappeared. Giancana acted like that night had never happened. But Frank couldn't forget. He started drinking more. His marriages crumbled. His relationship with his children strained. The world saw a superstar living the high life. But inside, Frank was drowning in secrets he could never share. In 1965, Frank tried to break free. He went to the FBI, wanted to tell everything. But when he arrived at the meeting, the agent already knew why he was there. On the agent's desk was a file, thick as a phone book. Frank's name was on it. The agent opened it, showed Frank a single page. It was enough. Frank left without saying a word. The cage had no doors. The following years brought more performances, more albums, more accolades. But every award felt hollow, every standing ovation, a reminder of what he'd lost that night in Vegas. When he sang songs about regret, about choices, about the road not taken, he wasn't performing, he was confessing. Frank's health began declining in the 1980s. The drinking had taken its toll, but it was more than that. The weight of secrets can kill a man slowly. During one of his last concerts, he stopped in the middle of The Way You Look Tonight and just stood there, silent, for a full minute. The audience thought it was emotion. It was memory. Tony Roma visited Frank regularly in his final years. They would sit in silence mostly, two old men carrying the burden of that December night. Sometimes Frank would ask Tony if he thought they'd be forgiven. Tony never answered. Some things are beyond forgiveness. In 1997, a year before Frank died, he gave Tony a sealed envelope. He made Tony promise not to open it until after both of them were gone. Tony kept that promise. Inside was Frank's confession, written in his shaky handwriting. Every detail of that night, every name, every threat, every regret. Frank wanted the truth known, but only when it couldn't hurt anyone still living. But here's what nobody knew until Tony's recording surfaced. There was another person in that room that night, a young woman, barely 20, who served drinks and was supposed to leave. But she didn't leave. She hid behind a curtain and heard everything. She was Giancana's niece, and she kept a diary. That diary surfaced in 2020, when her estate was settled. Her entries from December 1963 matched Tony's recordings perfectly, but she adds details Tony didn't know. The Washington man's real name, the exact nature of the Dallas plan, the names of everyone who would be eliminated to keep the secret. Frank's name was on that list too, but someone had crossed it out. A note in the margin said simply, "Too visible, natural causes." Frank lived another 35 years after that night, but in many ways, he died in that room on the 17th floor. The man who walked out wasn't the same one who walked in. He became a ghost haunting his own life, singing songs about a freedom he'd lost, a choice he'd surrendered, a soul he'd sold for a price he never wanted to pay. The saddest part is what Tony revealed in his final recording. Frank's last words to him, just days before he died. "Tony, I should have walked away. I should have let them destroy me. It would have been cleaner than this." Tony's voice breaks on the recording as he adds, "He was right. Some prices are too high, even for survival." When I first heard these recordings, I couldn't believe them. But then I started researching. Every date checks out. Every name Tony mentioned had connections to that world. The Washington man's identity, when I finally confirmed it, made my hands shake. This wasn't just about Frank. This was about the highest levels of power in America, about decisions that shaped history, about secrets that could still destroy lives today. The other members of the Rat Pack suspected something, but never knew the full truth. Dean Martin once told his son that Frank had changed after that December, that something had broken inside him. Sammy Davis Jr. wrote in a draft of his autobiography, later edited out, that Frank would sometimes look at him with such sadness, as if apologizing for something Sammy didn't understand. Peter Lawford knew more than the others. His connection to the Kennedys made him valuable and vulnerable. After that night, Frank gradually pushed Peter away. Not from anger, but from protection. Frank knew that anyone too close to the truth was in danger. Peter's decline into alcoholism and early death at 61 wasn't coincidental. He knew too much and couldn't live with it. Joey Bishop, the last surviving member of the Rat Pack, gave an interview in 2007, just months before his death. The interviewer asked him about Frank's transformation in the mid-60s. Joey stared at the camera for a long moment, then said, "Some stories should die with the people who lived them." He refused to elaborate, but his eyes said everything. The Sands Hotel was demolished in 1996. When they were clearing the 17th floor, construction workers found something strange. Behind a wall in the suite at the end of the corridor, there was a hidden compartment. Inside were recording devices, old but sophisticated for their time. The FBI was called. The devices were confiscated. The official report states nothing was found. But one of the workers took a photo before the FBI arrived. In the photo, you can see reels of tape. We'll never know what was on them. Frank's grave at Desert Memorial Park is simple. "The best is yet to come" is etched on his headstone. Visitors leave Jack Daniels bottles and cigarettes. But sometimes, you'll find a single red rose with a note that says only, "For the secrets you kept." Nobody knows who leaves them, but they appear every December, on the anniversary of that night. The real tragedy is that Frank spent his last decades trying to make amends in his own way. His charitable work, his support for civil rights, his dedication to helping young artists. It was all genuine, but it was also penance. He once told Tony that every good deed felt like trying to wash blood off his hands that only he could see. In one of the recordings, Tony mentions a moment that haunts me. After the meeting ended and everyone was leaving, Frank turned to Giancana and asked, "How do you live with it?" Giancana's response was chilling. "I don't live with it, Frank. I am it. Now so are you." That transformation, from Frank Sinatra the entertainer to Frank Sinatra the keeper of America's darkest secret, happened in just 3 hours on a December night in 1963. He walked into that room as one man and left as another. The world never knew the difference, but Frank lived with it every day until he drew his last breath. The most disturbing part of Tony's final recording is his revelation about why Frank was chosen. It wasn't just his connections or his influence. Giancana knew Frank's weakness, his loyalty to his friends. They knew he would do anything to protect the people he loved. They used his greatest virtue as the weapon to destroy him. Frank realized this too late, and the knowledge that his love for others had been weaponized against him was perhaps the cruelest cut of all. Today, most of the people involved are dead. The few who remain are in their 90s, taking their secrets to graves that are rapidly approaching. But the recordings exist. The diary exists. The evidence, scattered and hidden, tells a story that reshapes our understanding of that era. Frank Sinatra wasn't just an entertainer who knew dangerous people. He was a man forced to become a pivotal piece in a game so dangerous that even now, 60 years later, there are those who would kill to keep it buried. The last thing Tony recorded, just days before his own death, was a warning. "If you're listening to this, be careful. They told us it was over when Frank died. They lied. It's never over. Some secrets are like radiation. They keep poisoning long after the source is gone. Frank knew this. He tried to warn me. Now I'm warning you." I've thought long and hard about sharing this story. The danger is real, even now. But Frank deserves to have his truth told. He wasn't just the voice or old blue eyes. He was a man caught in an impossible situation who paid the ultimate price. Not his life, but his soul. And he paid it to protect others, to prevent even worse outcomes, to navigate an impossible choice between personal destruction and becoming an accomplice to history's darkest moments. When you listen to Frank's music now, knowing what you hear it differently. The melancholy in the wee small hours, the defiance in my way, the resignation in that's life. They weren't just songs. They were confessions hidden in plain sight, messages in bottles thrown into an ocean of audiences who could never understand their real meaning. Frank Sinatra died on May 14, 1998, at 82 years old. The official cause was heart attack, but Tony Roma knew better. Frank had been ready to die for years. He'd been dying since December 1963. It just took his body 35 years to catch up with his spirit. The 17th floor of the Sands Hotel is gone now, but its ghosts remain. Sometimes, late at night in Vegas, old-timers say you can still hear music drifting through the desert air. I've Got You Under My Skin, the song that was playing when Frank Sinatra walked into that room and lost himself forever. This is the story that was buried for 60 years. This is the truth about the night that changed everything. And now that you know it, you understand why some secrets should never have been kept, and why some men pay prices that no amount of fame or fortune can ever redeem. Frank's final recording, made just weeks before his death, has him singing My Way one last time. But if you listen carefully, at the very end, after the music stops, you can hear him whisper something. Tony enhanced the audio. Frank's words are clear. Forgive me. We may never know who he was asking. Maybe all of us. Maybe none of us. Maybe God himself. But one thing is certain. Frank Sinatra went to his grave, carrying the weight of that December night in 1963, when the mob, the government, and forces beyond our understanding came together in a room on the 17th floor of the Sands Hotel and changed not just one man's life, but the course of American history itself. The best was yet to come? No. For Frank, the best ended that night in Vegas. Everything after was just a man trying to find redemption in a world that had already condemned him. And perhaps that's the greatest tragedy of all, that the voice that brought joy to millions was silenced by secrets he never wanted to keep, singing songs of freedom while living in the most elaborate prison ever constructed, the prison of truth, too dangerous to tell.